The suspected members of a drug cartel in Mexico are apologizing for the abduction and killing of several American citizens, and appear to have handed over 5 of their own henchmen to authorities said to have been involved.
In Panama, troops loyal to General Noriega have attacked the American military headquarters. American forces are said to have fought off the attack. Officials at the Pentagon said tonight more American troops may have to be sent to Panama if the fighting continues.
We've seen war. We don't want war. But if you want war with the United States of America, there's one thing I can promise you, so help me God. Someone else will raise your sons and daughters.
November 9th, 2009. Ociel Cárdenas, leader of the Gulf Cartel, held 2 U.S. federal agents at gunpoint for spying on his cartel's operations. But fearing U.S. retaliation, he let them go. Turns out he was right to be afraid, because not long after, U.S. forces working with Mexican military came down hard on his cartel. And what they did to him changed the course of his life forever. Here's some times cartels messed with the wrong Americans.
Targeted by the notorious Zetas drug cartel, 2 Homeland Security agents were under fire inside this armored SUV on Mexico's Highway 57.
The assailants came directly over to Jaime's door and opened the door, swung the door wide open, and I saw him with a handgun in his hand.
I would never say something as bold as that because I do not have a crystal ball, but what I will say is that Mexican law enforcement authorities and the Mexican government will do anything and everything in their power to find these individuals and swiftly bring them to justice.
Around 2 p.m. on February 15th, 2011, 2 U.S. federal agents are ambushed in Mexico by a ruthless cartel. Tragically, one of those agents, Jaime Zapata, lost his life. Now, his death pissed off the U.S. government so much that it led to one of the most destructive crackdowns against cartels in Mexico. But to understand the depth of that tragedy and the extent the U.S. was willing to go to get justice, it's important to know who Jaime was and why his loss was so profound. Born and raised in Brownsville, Texas, Jaime Jorge Zapata had a deep sense of duty from a young age. He always stepped up to protect his family and those around him. Not so surprisingly, he would carry that same determination into his career in law enforcement, joining the U.S. Border Patrol on February 6, 2006. And after completing his training with the 611th session of the Border Patrol Academy, he was stationed in Yuma, Arizona. But Zapata wasn't the type to sit still. He transitioned into US's ICE, working in Laredo, Texas, on human smuggling and trafficking cases, and he was doing well for himself. And his career was on the rise, but so was the danger that came with it. On February 15, 2011, Zapata and his partner, Victor Avila, were driving this government-issued Chevy Suburban down Highway 57, a major route connecting Mexico City to Monterrey. And at around 2 p.m., they noticed 2 SUVs speeding toward them. The vehicles aggressively cut them off and forced them to the side of the road. Now, it kind of looked like a possible carjacking, a terrifyingly common crime in cartel-controlled areas. But this was actually far worse. The men who stepped out would be members of Los Zetas, a brutal Mexican drug syndicate. Zapata and Avila cracked down their windows, hoping to de-escalate the situation. They identified themselves as U.S. diplomats, but the response they got was merciless.
"We don't give a fuck."
And then gunfire erupted. Zapata's fighting to keep the doors locked, even as gunmen try to yank him from the driver's seat. A round hits him in the leg, then the chest. And though the SUV was bullet-resistant, the doors had automatically unlocked when he put the car in park. One of the cartel members reached in and shot him at point-blank range. Bleeding out, Zapata somehow managed to shift the car into drive, and he pushes forward trying to escape before collapsing at the wheel. Avila, on the other hand, was wounded in the leg, yet he was able to make a desperate call for help. And within minutes, a Mexican federal police chopper arrives. But for Zapata, it was too late. His death sent shockwaves throughout Mexico and the U.S. The last time a U.S. Fed had been killed by a Mexican cartel in the line of duty was way back in 1985. So it was something no one expected would happen again. Looks like the cartels got more bold, a little powerful, just ambushing U.S. law enforcement in broad daylight. Question was no longer whether the violence would cross the border, but when. And of course, the U.S. government had to wipe that thought away before it became a reality. But before that, more disturbing details came to light during this investigation into the incident. Law enforcement discovered that the weapon used in killing Zapata, a semi-auto WASR-10, had been illegally purchased in Dallas, Texas, and smuggled into Mexico as part of this larger gun-running nightmare known as Operation Fast and Furious. The attack also exposed the fact that U.S. agents working in Mexico weren't allowed to carry firearms, leaving them defenseless against cartels armed with military-grade weapons. This would piss off U.S. citizens, and they demanded justice. The pressure was on, and the U.S. government under Obama's regime demanded action. The Mexican authorities were left with no other option than to launch their own full-force manhunt. February 23, 2011, just a few days after the incident, Mexican forces, in collaboration with the FBI, raid a home in San Luis Potosi, capturing 6 men with 6 weapons. U.S. forensics later matched 3 of those weapons to some of the 90 shell casings recovered from the crime scene on Federal Highway 57. But the U.S. wanted more than foot soldiers. They wanted the masterminds, the men who called the hit on Zapata. So, one by one, Zetas members are hunted down. Among them was Jesus Enrique Rejon Aguilar, a top Los Zetas leader, and Jose Garcia Sota, one of the gunmen who had fired on the agents. And in a rare show of cooperation, the Mexican government extradited 7 of the suspects to the U.S. That had to be one of the fastest murder cases solved in Mexico ever. Now, some of those captured Zetas members would turn on their brothers, providing key testimony and information about the cartel in exchange for lighter sentences. But for 2 of the men who had been directly responsible for the attack, Garcia Sota and Jesus Ivan Quezada Piña, there would be no mercy. On July 27, 2017, these guys are convicted on many charges, including murdering a federal officer. Now, the judge handed down 2 life sentences each, meaning they would never walk free again. But despite justice getting served here, maybe, the murder of Zapata left an indelible mark on U.S.-Mexican relations. Plus, a lot of Zeta soldiers went into hiding, fearing that U.S. agents would invade their territory and wipe away their labs, and arrest as many of them as they could. And the fact that a couple of their leaders could just get captured in a matter of days was pretty evident that no one was safe there. Now, Zapata might have been collateral damage in the fight against cartels, but the Zetas learned a valuable lesson. You don't kill U.S. federal agents and get away with it.
4 Americans kidnapped at gunpoint moments after crossing from Texas into Mexico on Friday.
Cartel violence has plagued the area, and now 4 Americans caught in crossfire are missing.
A powerful Mexican drug cartel has allegedly taken responsibility for the kidnapping of 4 U.S. citizens and killing 2 of them. Now they apologize.
On March 3, 2023, Latavia Tay Washington McGee sets out to Mexico to get some surgery on her abdomen, the kind that many mothers opt for. With medical costs in the U.S. being sky high, Mexico has a cheaper option. Plus, she was no stranger to the country, having previously traveled there for cosmetic procedures. And she wasn't going alone. She had her cousin, Shaid Woodard, and 2 friends, Zindel Brown and Eric James Williams, who would join her on this 1,400-mile drive from Lake City, South Carolina to Matamoros, Tamaulipas, just south of the border. So they cross into Matamoros in a white minivan with North Carolina plates, likely expecting nothing more than a routine trip. But instead of looking forward to a cheap procedure, they drive straight into a nightmare. Now, in case you didn't know for some reason, Tamaulipas is one of the most dangerous states in Mexico, infamous for cartel violence, kidnappings, and deadly territorial disputes. This place, more specifically Matamoros, is a battleground for warring factions of the Gulf Cartel, who fight to control the lucrative smuggling routes into the U.S. Carjacking, shootings, and every bad vice and crime books happen right here. Even Latavia herself knew about this, but she played it risky, believing it would be an in-and-out trip, and she wasn't really bothered by anything. And besides, she had company with her. The sad thing is, what she didn't know was when it comes to these cartels, anything is possible. Now, shortly after crossing the border, their minivan gets crashed into, and there's a hail of gunfire.
We heard a car beat the horn and pulled around us. Zendel was in the back seat. He said, "Don't stop." He saw a gun.
We drove through a few streets and corners until we got back on the main street, and that's when a gang of shooting started.
Gunmen storm in and drag the 4 Americans into the bed of a white pickup truck. Video footage captures in broad daylight heavily armed men in tan body armor loading them in. One victim appears to be alive and sitting up, while the others look either injured or just unresponsive. Then the truck sped off, leaving behind chaos and a bullet-ridden vehicle. Investigators later suggested that the group was mistakenly identified as Haitian drug smugglers, and the cartel allegedly involved in the attack moved the victims from location to location, even stopping at a medical clinic in an attempt to evade authorities. The kidnapping sent shockwaves again through Mexico and the U.S., while Mexican officials scrambled to locate this group. We had a special task force, including the Mexican military, National Guard, and state police working round the clock to track the victims. And then, by March 7th, 4 days after the abduction, authorities get this anonymous tip leading them to a shack deep in the rural outskirts of Matamoros. They navigate dirt roads until they spot the location, a small wooden structure with a white pickup parked outside. Inside, Latavia McGee and Eric Williams were found blindfolded but alive. Tragically, Shaid Woodard and Zindel Brown lay beside him, wrapped in blankets and plastic bags. Williams had been shot in the leg, while McGee was physically unharmed but undoubtedly traumatized. A guard wearing a tactical vest tried to escape but was quickly apprehended. Mexican authorities waste no time, and within hours, McGee and Williams are taken back to the U.S., escorted by a convoy of Mexican ambulances, armored vehicles, state police, and the National Guard. And once safely across that border, they're rushed to a hospital for treatment. But you know, back in Mexico, the news of this swift rescue operation sparked outrage. Activists and opposition leaders are questioning why authorities moved so quickly for 4 Americans when over 100,000 Mexicans remain missing, with their cases long forgotten about. Human Rights Watch researcher Tyler Matisse summed up the frustration by saying in a press conference,
"We live in a country where thousands go missing every year, and authorities rarely do anything. It's truly remarkable how fast they acted in this case."
I mean, the pressure from the U.S. government was really intense, so it's safe to say they didn't really have any choice but to act fast. And then came this unexpected twist. March 9th, the Gulf Cartel issues an apology. Oh yeah, you heard that right. A cartel apologized.
It's not of any surprise that they're under a lot of pressure to put this behind them and try to distance themselves as best they can.
In a letter obtained by the Associated Press, they condemned the attack, calling it a mistake, and claimed the perpetrators had acted against the cartel's rules. As a show of contrition, they turned over 5 of their own members to authorities, leaving them bound and face down with a note that read,
"The guilty parties will pay."
The fear of U.S. retaliation's a powerful motivation, huh? The cartel clearly wanted no trouble. They turned over guys without blinking an eye. And let's be honest, those men might have not even been real cartel members. And that letter could have been fake. But the fact that a criminal group goes out of its way to make peace, that's pretty crazy if you ask us.
In the last half hour, the United Nations General Assembly has adopted a resolution deploring the United States intervention in Panama.
The Americans called the attack Operation Just Cause. They declared it a success.
On December 16, 1989, U.S. Marine Lieutenant Robert Paz lost his life in Panama. You might not have heard about this guy, but believe us when we tell you that his death set off the largest U.S. military operation in Latin America's history. For decades, Paz's story has been little more than a footnote in history books. But who was he? And how did he become a key figure in the chain of events leading to war? Well, Paz grows up on a farm in Cali, Colombia, with his Colombian father and American mother. He later moves on to the U.S., where he attended Michigan State University, studying animal science. But his future takes a different turn when he joins the Marines. By 1989, he's stationed in Panama as an intel officer, arriving just as tensions between General Manuel Noriega and the Bush administration were reaching a boiling point. Now, to understand how everything escalated, let's take a step back. You see, in 1989, Colonel Manuel Antonio Noriega became the head of the Panamanian military after Colonel Rubén Paredes stepped down to run for president. However, Noriega convinced Paredes to drop out, paving the way for Eric Del Valle's presidency. But in reality, Del Valle's a puppet, with Noriega back here pulling the strings. And there's really no surprise since Noriega wasn't new to power plays. Back in 1968, when Panama's last free election was overturned by a military coup, this guy was climbing the ranks as an intel officer. Over the years, he formed strong ties with the CIA, helping the U.S. combat leftist groups in Nicaragua and El Salvador. He would also work with the DEA, feeding him intel on drug shipments from Colombia to the U.S. But sources say at the same time he was secretly running his own drug trafficking cartel, making him a pretty corrupt figure in Latin America. So they say. By 1988, U.S. authorities had had enough. Noriega was indicted in Florida on drug charges, and President Del Valle attempted to fire him. But Noriega ignored the order and kept his grip on power. The U.S. tried to push the Panamanian military to overthrow him, but that coup attempt in March 1988 failed. Meanwhile, over 12,000 U.S. troops are stationed in Panama, watching as this situation spirals. This was the environment Paz found himself in when he was assigned to the counter-narcotics operation at Howard Air Force Base near Panama City. There he worked alongside military officials, including his friend and colleague, Haddad. They bonded like best friends, workouts, beers, sports. Haddad was teasing Paz about Michigan State's football team sucking. But then came the night of December 16, 1989. It was a Saturday, and despite the rising tensions, Paz and 3 fellow officers decided to go out for dinner at the Marriott Hotel. They knew U.S. troops had movement restrictions, especially after Noriega had declared a state of war against the U.S. the day before. But they figured a quiet dinner in a nice neighborhood wouldn't be a problem. Haddad would drive the group in his Chevy Impala. They were unarmed and dressed in civilian clothing. Everything seemed fine until they got lost. In the maze of Panama City streets, they accidentally took a wrong turn and end up near Noriega's military HQ, La Comandancia. And before they could find their way out, they're stopped at a checkpoint. This checkpoint is manned by soldiers from the Macho de Monte Infantry Unit, one of Noriega's most feared forces. Tensions were already high because another U.S. Navy officer and his wife had been stopped and detained just moments earlier. And within seconds, the crowd that had gathered was getting more hostile. But the real problem started when a soldier saw their U.S. military IDs. Well, that soldier jammed an AK-47 into Haddad's ribs, while another pulled open the car doors. Haddad then noticed a man from Noriega's militia aiming a machine gun at him from the crowd. Seeing an opening when a police car moved away, Haddad makes a split-second decision. He shouted to his friends,
"If we're going, we have to go now."
They agreed, and he floored it. The car shot forward, but they didn't get far. Within seconds, gunfire erupted. Bullets ripped through that vehicle, with one striking Paz in the back. Knowing they had to act fast, Haddad sped toward the U.S. Canal Zone, racing to get Paz to the hospital. They get to Gorgas Hospital in under 5 minutes, but it's too late. The bullet had ruptured Paz's renal artery, and he didn't survive. Back at the U.S. military base, officials were skeptical at first, questioning whether Haddad had acted recklessly. But those doubts vanished when the Navy officer and his wife, who'd been detained earlier, confirmed the soldiers at the checkpoint had fired first. The officer had been beaten, and his wife had been assaulted and threatened with rape. Meanwhile, the Panamanian government released a statement claiming that Americans had driven toward La Comandancia and had fired first. The U.S. knew that wasn't true. And just like that, the Bush administration was done. President George H.W. Bush addresses the nation, stating that Noriega's forces had killed an unarmed U.S. Marine, injured another, and brutally mistreated American citizens. He declared that enough was enough, and just 2 days later, Operation Just Cause was launched. At 1 a.m. on December 20th, nearly 26,000 U.S. troops stormed Panama. It was the biggest military operation since Vietnam, and the first real test for new American war machines like the Apache helicopter, Humvee, and stealth aircraft. The invasion starts with a bang. Literally, U.S. forces bombed key military sites and captured Panama's main port. Elite SEAL teams destroy Noriega's private jet and gunboat, cutting off his escape routes. Rangers and paratroopers launched massive airborne assaults, securing strategic locations, with intense firefights breaking out around Panama City as American forces closed in on La Comandancia. Apache choppers fired their missiles into the HQ, sealing Noriega's fate. Hurrah! So, knowing he's out of options, Noriega fled to the Vatican's diplomatic office, hoping for some asylum. But the U.S. had a different strategy. Psychological warfare. They surrounded his building and blasted rock music, like AC/DC's You Shook Me All Night Long, and Guns N' Roses' Welcome to the Jungle, for days, trying to force him out. Eventually, Noriega cracked. On January 3rd, 1990, he walked out and surrendered. The U.S. invasion officially ends within weeks, while Noriega is extradited to the U.S., sentenced to 40 years in prison. Later, he's sent off to France and then back to Panama, where he faced more charges. But ultimately, he died in 2017 from a surgery to remove a brain tumor. As for Lieutenant Paz, his service didn't go unnoticed. The Marines arranged for his body to be flown back to Colombia, where his parents were living. And while his story may not always be at the forefront of history, it's probably the biggest and best example of why other countries, let alone cartels, fear American citizens. Sometimes showing mercy is a pretty wise choice, but other times it could be a fatal mistake, just like Ociel Cardenas, who let 2 U.S. feds live, only to end up losing his own freedom because of it. On November 9th, 1990, 2 U.S. federal agents, one DEA, the other FBI, find themselves staring down the barrels of cartel guns in Matamoros, Tamaulipas. The Gulf Cartel had them cornered. Death seemed inevitable. Their only way out, a desperate gamble, one that could either save their lives or seal their fate. At the time, the Gulf Cartel wasn't something you'd want to mess with, a far cry from its humble beginnings as a smuggling ring in the 1930s, founded by notorious kingpin Juan Guerra. By the 1970s, under kingpin Juan Abrego, it evolved into a billion-dollar empire, running drug routes from Colombia straight into the U.S. But when Abrego was arrested in 1996 and sentenced to 11 life terms, the cartel crumbled into chaos. Infighting followed, and through sheer brutality, Ociel Cardenas Guillen clawed his way to the top by taking out his enemies, his own friends included sometimes. To maintain control, he assembles a group of ex-military and calls them Los Zetas. And unlike his predecessors, Cardenas Guillen had no political protection, so he dominated through pure violence. Now fast forward to that afternoon in 1999. DEA agent Joe Dubois and the FBI agent Daniel Fuentes are driving through Matamoros, gathering intel on cartel operations. Riding along with them is Bermudez Nunez, an informant, and they're cruising past cartel safe houses, photographing stash locations. But as they're nearing Cardenas Guillen's mansion, they notice something's off. A pair of suspicious vehicles are trailing them, and when the agents call in one of the license plates, they get confirmation. It was stolen. Their instincts were right. And before they can react, their SUV is cut off. Within seconds, 8 cartel vehicles surround them, blocking every escape route. Around 15 armed men pour out, all having AK-47s or AR-15s, maybe some handguns. Some would wear police uniforms. And in that moment, it was clear this was not a random attack. It was an ambush. The cartel had them exactly where they wanted. The agents had no backup. Calls to local police went unanswered, and the state commander who could have intervened just stepped back. With nowhere to run, the two feds make a chilling decision. They wouldn't allow themselves to be kidnapped. If this is the end, they'd go down fighting. But they had one last card to play: talking their way out. I mean, we don't advise anyone to make this kind of choice, but hey, at that time it was pretty brilliant. Then, from a white Jeep Cherokee, out steps Cardenas Guillen himself, gold-plated AK-47 in his hand, a pistol tucked into his belt, and he approaches the agent's vehicle, recognizing the informant, and barked out his demand.
Get out of your car, you sons of... I'm going to...
The agents refused. Fuentes flashed his FBI badge, but Guillen didn't really care. He cursed at him, pointed his rifle at Fuentes' head, and demanded they handed over the informant. Still, they hold their ground, and that's when Dubois played his ace. He looks at Cardenas Guillen in the eye and warns him.
Think it over, man. If you touch us, the U.S. government will never stop hunting you.
You see, he reminded him of what happened back in '85 with Kiki Camarena being tortured and killed by a cartel, telling Cardenas that harming him would bring him 300,000 new enemies. At that moment, Cardenas hesitated. I mean, this guy's ruthless, but he's not stupid. Killing these feds would bring a storm on him that he wasn't prepared to handle. His sicarios raised their weapons, waiting for their boss's order. Dubois and Fuentes knew they were seconds away from death. But then, in a sudden turn, Cardenas backs off. He tells him to just get out of here. Without wasting a second, the guys drive straight to the border as cartel vehicles tail him all the way. Now, in some part of his mind, Cardenas surely believed that he made the right choice, but only God knew that his life was going to change for the worst. You see, the moment these agents cross into Texas, they call their superiors. Coincidentally, top U.S. and Mexican officials were having a meeting in Washington, D.C. that very day, and within hours, calls are made, alarms raised, and Cardenas Guillen becomes a marked man. The U.S. government turns up the heat on the Gulf Cartel, making them a top priority to go after, especially Cardenas. Now, before this, he wasn't exactly a household name in the world of organized crime, but his role in the standoff changed that fast. Practically overnight, he goes from being another cartel figure to a top 10 on the FBI and DEA's hit list, and he's slapped with charges of international drug trafficking and assault. The DEA didn't hold back, calling that standoff one of the most serious attacks on U.S. officials in Mexico since the brutal murder of DEA agent Kiki Camarena. And to spice things up, they started throwing out rumors that local police was involved, adding another wild twist to the case. And while Mexican officials weren't ready to confirm anything, they did vow to launch a full-scale investigation. But yeah, the DEA has definitely heard this before, so now they're not willing to take any chances. Just days after that incident, they start reinforcing their presence in Mexico, even shipping over a bunch of APVs to make sure that their agents weren't sitting ducks. So to answer U.S. demands, then Mexican President Ernesto Zedillo sent the military sweeping through Tamaulipas, hitting places like Matamoros, Reynosa, and Nuevo Laredo to hunt down this new high-profile target. But Cardenas Guillen was already ahead of the game. He had slipped out of Tamaulipas and into Nuevo León with a handful of his most loyal men. So determined to track this guy down, U.S. agents would start digging into his personal life. They questioned his father, uncle, and even his brother, Olmedo, who surprisingly wasn't suspected of any cartel activity. And that's when they got their big break into his whereabouts. Wiretapped phone calls between Guillen and his wife, Celia Salinas Aguilar, revealed he was hiding in Monterrey with his family. So they start tracking the family, the cars they drive, where their kids go to school. Investigators track down one of his Colombian girlfriends also, Andrea Posadas Williamson, who would spill the beans on his exact location. So on the morning of March 14th, 2003, at around 9:45 a.m., the Mexican army caught up with Cardenas in Matamoros, sparking a wild shootout with his gunmen. And when the dust settled, Cardenas Guillen and several of his members were arrested. So he spends a few years in Mexico before being shipped out to the U.S. in 2007. But in 2010, he's sentenced to 25 years in prison. And if that seems kind of short to you, well, let's just say that there's rumors that he cut a deal with the feds. But that's a story for another day.
Authorities in Mexico say they captured Rafael Caro Quintero, a member of the Sinaloa cartel. He is suspected in the 1985 torture and killing of a DEA agent in Mexico.
Agent Camarena's story is a perfect example of what happens when you mess with the wrong Americans. The only difference here is Camarena had to tragically die in a horrible way before the U.S. did anything about it. And in this chilling audio recording released 3 years after his brutal death, in 1985, you can hear Camarena pleading with his captors.
Couldn't I ask you to have my ribs bandaged, please?
That recording is the only evidence we have of his final agonizing moments before his execution. And this is all because back in 1981, the DEA had sent him to Guadalajara, Mexico, after his assignments in California. And his mission would be to get some intel on drug trafficking. Camarena knew the risks, but this guy was determined to make a difference on the new war on drugs. And he did, but at a deadly price. After 4 years of his investigation, Camarena would help coordinate a massive raid on Rancho Bufalo, a sprawling 2,500-acre marijuana plantation run by the Guadalajara Cartel. This bust was a major catastrophe for him, wiping out an operation that brought in like $8 billion a year. The takedown rattled everybody, cartels and political leaders. And back then, the DEA wasn't the actual powerhouse it is today. It had little influence in Mexico, where corruption was everywhere. Kinda still is. And after that raid, the cartel realized Camarena was on the verge of exposing even more of their operations. Mexico felt they had no choice but to take this guy out. On February 7th, 1985, Camarena's leaving the U.S. consulate in Guadalajara, ready to meet up with his wife for lunch. And then out of nowhere, armed men grab him in front of this place and force him into a van. He can't resist because he's outnumbered and outgunned, so really no point. And that would be the last time he was ever seen alive. A month later, the DEA finds his body 70 miles outside Guadalajara, alongside the remains of Captain Alfredo Zavala Avelar, the Mexican pilot helping him with Rancho Bufalo. Both these guys were savagely tortured. Camarena's skull, jaw, and ribs were shattered, his windpipe crushed, and he had a hole drilled into his head. His autopsy would show amphetamines and other drugs, a cruel sign he was kept conscious during the torture. That was the first time an active U.S. agent would get killed during the line of duty, and the U.S. government wasn't gonna take that. So what follows is the biggest manhunt in DEA history, Operation Leyenda. In preparation for this, the DEA doubled its agents and wrapped up drug seizures by over 40%. Then came some more direct action. Special Agent Walt Breslin entered Mexico undercover with a small team of agents and former Mexican police officers. Their first big move? Snatching the doctor who had kept Camarena alive while he was tortured. Forced to confess, the doctor tells him that a former Mexican intelligence officer was the one inflicting the pain. The agents smuggled the doctor across the border and into the U.S. to face trial. Operation Leyenda would also unearth a darker truth. The corruption in Mexico was pretty bad, worse than they thought. The investigation showed that the Guadalajara cartel hadn't just bribed police, they owned them. The cartel had the Jalisco State Police on its payroll and would even use them to kidnap Camarena. The corruption ran so deep that high-ranking officials like governors and even federal agents had been bought off. Just a few million could buy you loyalty, silence, and protection, and the cartel had plenty of cash to spend. The fallout from Camarena's murder was massive. The U.S. didn't just go after the cartel. They overhauled the war on drugs. The DEA, once a minor player in international law enforcement, suddenly had teeth. They were given more power, more funding, and more freedom to operate abroad. The Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1986 poured billions into drug enforcement, tightening international drug relations, and even allowing the U.S. to withhold aid from countries that didn't crack down on trafficking. Simply put, if Mexico wanted American money, they had to cooperate. But since many believe that Camarena's death was payback for shutting down the Rancho Bufalo, cartel leaders Felix Gallardo and Rafael Caro Quintero would receive most of the blame, and were both extradited to the U.S. to serve time. This is why we keep talking about Camarena. He's like the epicenter that sparked off the fight against drug trafficking. His death changed the entire game, on both sides. Suddenly, the DEA had this global influence. The war on drugs goes crazy, and the big cartels still remaining had to rethink their strategies to stay ahead of an enraged U.S. government. This guy didn't just shake up the cartels. He changed the way the world fights the drug trade forever.